Hello and welcome to Chapter 6, Surveys and Observations. Today we're going to be talking about the purpose of surveys and how to go about creating good questions and therefore surveys. Now we must recognize that surveys are a non-experimental method. You should never refer to a study that is essentially a survey as somehow an experiment. That is a misuse of the term experiment. The purpose of a survey is to get a systematic understanding of the lay of the land, so to speak, on a topic. We want to understand what are participants' reported behaviors. What do they say that they do? What do they say their attitudes about things might be, or preferences or opinions? Whenever you hear about presidential polling, that's a survey. Surveys are all over the place. Survey is often misused for any list of questions, but that is a misstatement, and you got to be very careful about the use of the word survey when you've become educated about research methods, as you are becoming. Often in psychology, we have these things that are called scales. They resemble surveys, but they are not surveys. Scales are designed to measure a single psychological construct, or one or two that are closely related, much like a ruler that is measuring height or a scale that's measuring weight. Surveys are for getting at a broad collection of issues and may include scales within them. So, what you get from a survey is an overview of responses in the population, frequency type questions that will give you some sense of the typical response that people might give, the range of responses that could be gotten from a population, the rarity of responses to get a sense of what are the unusual things that might be in terms of people's attitudes and behaviors. And you can often calculate correlations and what are called cross tabulations amongst the responses to get a sense of association about the questions. A cross tabulation is simply a kind of correlation technique that is used for nominal scale data. Remember that from Chapter 5, the differences between the different scales, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Examples of typicality, and these are all hypothetical, none of these are related to any actual studies that are out there. The most commonly reported first date is dinner and a movie. The mean reported age of graduation from college is 24.3 years old. 47% of respondents say they feel Obama is doing a good job as president. Range examples, where you get some sense of the high and low. 28 distinctive first dates were described by respondents. The age of graduation from college ranged from 18 to 72 years. Recent polls have ranged from 40 to 49% of respondents saying that they feel Obama is doing a good job as president. All those would give you a sense of the minimal and maximum responses, or at least some sense of how diverse the responses might be. Other rarity examples, again, all hypothetical. First dates reported by one person each were a weekend trip to Europe and or a ride-along snowplowing date, while two persons reported running a marathon as a first date. Only one person older than 65 reported graduating from college, two between 60 and 65. One poll treated as an outlier, with only 25% saying Obama is doing a good job. All of those would be describing rare examples that nevertheless show up in a data set. Now, how we go about constructing surveys is important to get a handle on because it is deceptively difficult. Many people think they can easily construct questions. All you have to do is just, start writing things, and of course people will give you responses. You have to determine what your research objectives are. What is the issue you want to try to examine? What are you after in your data? You write one or more questions for each issue. And you don't want to be shy about borrowing, but you do make sure that you cite where you got material from in your research report. Using borrowed questions from other surveys often has the advantage of allowing you to make comparisons to the previous work by others, and that can be advantageous in terms of interpretation. You also want to make a decision as to whether or not you want an open-ended or closed, or what sometimes is referred to, and your book uses this term, forced choice responding, where you open-ended being person can give you anything that they can imagine writing down, whereas forced choice is you give them a list of things to pick from and they must pick only from that list. Writing questions is very difficult to get right. It's very easy to get wrong. You can write a question that can have multiple interpretations. For instance, how do you feel about smoking? Now, you may have immediately thought, well, how do I feel about others smoking? But if you're a smoker, you might be really, or a former smoker, you might immediately think, well, how do I feel about my smoking? And so you can see right there that the vagueness of the question does not help us to know how the person is responding. If you really want to know how people feel about others smoking, you need to have the word others in there. And if you want to know how people feel about their own smoking, if they do it, you have to write the question to capture that somehow. There's also an issue that can occur that almost nobody that's not taken a research class really has a handle on, but is vital. It's called double-barreled questions. How do you feel about slow traffic that makes you late for work? That's actually two questions in one. It is a question about slow traffic, and it is a question about being late for work. If you want to know about slow traffic, ask about slow traffic. If you want to know about people being late for work, ask about being late for work. And if you somehow want to get at both of them, ask both questions separately, and we can use cross-tabulation and correlation methods to determine how people feel about both being slow trafficked and them being late for work. We can get at it, but it does take a little bit of work. Leading questions can also be a real problem. How the question is framed can have a large effect on how people respond. For instance, do you agree that cruel punishments ought to be outlawed? Well, the word cruel characterizes the question as one that few would agree with. Very few people will say, oh yes, cruel punishments, let's go for it. No one's really feeling that way, or very few people are feeling that way. And so you need to be careful of exactly what you're after in the question. What are you really trying to learn? Are you trying to learn about certain kinds of punishment, such as capital punishment, life prison sentences, corporal punishment in schools? What is it exactly you're trying to learn about? And once you've characterized what you're trying to learn about, then you insert that into the question to ensure that you're getting the response that you're really after. Negative wording in questions can cause terrible confusion. Negative information is generally more difficult for people to process. It's more likely to make an error in reading, and double negatives are especially difficult. And so whenever you have a question that has a double negative characterization in it, you've basically put people in a terrible bind about how to think about the question. It causes them to think so hard about it that it increases their doubt about how to respond. And usually it adds error to your measurement, which is almost always a bad thing. The ordering of questions is also something that's very important to get right. You want your first questions in a survey to be relatively easy to answer, obviously relevant to what's going on. You want them to be engaging, to have what we refer to as a closed format, as we were saying earlier, or forced choice, so that people don't have to really create answers nearly so much as respond to what they're seeing on the paper. It gets people accustomed to responding, gets them into a rhythm of working with the survey. Survey, if it's a person being done person to person, or if it's on computer, it simply gets them going, gets them doing it. Then you want the wording, as we described earlier, getting that right so as to avoid problems. You also want to vary the style of asking the questions and make sure that you switch up the response set, and make sure when you do it, it's very clear that you've switched it up. That way you can get a greater validity of responses. And when you do the switch up of response set to make it so that a person is responding usually on an attitude scale, saying they like something, you have some questions that are about not liking. But you got to be very careful to not have too much negative wording. You want to phrase it not so much as liking the thing as liking the opposite of the thing that you're asking about. And so if you're asking persons about how much they like shopping at big box stores, you might ask questions about shopping at big box stores, and then you could ask them about shopping at small stores. And that would be kind of opposite of the big box, and you're getting at it. You could have some negative word questions in there, but you want to make sure you check their statistical validity very careful. Or actually their construct validity to make sure that they're working for you. Right? Do they have good internal consistency characteristics? You also want to be aware of how ordering can affect. There's a very provocative example I'm going to use here. I get it from another textbook I used some years back, but it's just so good that I think it will really help you to remember the idea. I'm going to ask you to rate Britney Spears. Now, this is one way I could give you two questions about rating Britney Spears. I want you to rate her on the scale from kind to cruel, and you're asked to just circle one of the dots along that line. And then the next question is nice to nasty. Now, that provides you with one interpretation of nice to nasty. But I could ask it this way. Rate Britney Spears. And the first question is not sexy to sexy. And then the second question being nice to nasty. It's quite obvious here that the nice to nasty scale changes its meaning when it's preceded by kind or cruel as compared to when it's preceded by not sexy to sexy. So I want you to be very, very much aware that the ordering that questions are asked can have a profound effect on how later questions are interpreted, later response situations are interpreted. Then we also want to be aware of response scales in general, something that we've talked about. I'm going to remind you of because it matters. The levels of measurement from lowest to highest of information content. We didn't emphasize that aspect of it earlier, but nominal scale, simple categorization, actually has the lowest amount of information content about your object that you're observing. It's a simple name for it. It gives you no sense of how it sits with related in relation to others, except that it's different somehow. Now, that's not a bad thing, and it may be all you can observe. And so you want to observe what you can, but be aware that that is still the lowest level of information you can obtain in an observation. There's ordinal scales. That's where you have ordering or ranked categories or ranked scores, the placement of something along a line or in a race or that kind of thing. And an ordinal scale, of course, is a higher amount of information because not only have you attached some kind of name to it, which is usually like first, second, or third, but that has meaning relative to other things along that are other objects that could be measured as being greater than, more than, less than, etc. Interval scales is even more information because the distance between each named point along the scale is similar to other similarly named distances along the scale. So the difference from first to second being 1 unit is the same distance as second to third. In an ordinal scale, first may only be preceding second place by 7/1000ths of a second, as happened in a Formula One race a few weeks ago, and second to third could be a half of a second. And that would, you do know who first, second, and third is, but the distances are not well conveyed by first, second, and third. Those time values give you a much greater sense, more information about how close the racers were. Obviously, the car that came in second place was really close, whereas the one that came in third place was close, but still a good bit behind compared to the difference in first and second. And that's where interval scales and ratio scales give you tremendous advantage. Ratio scales having the added value of 0 means none of something. The quantity is none. And of course, when we're talking about that timing and the finish of the race, it is actually a ratio scale. But it's valuable because you can actually use doubling the meaning of twice as much or half as much as conveyed and meaningful. These are important things to get. You want to always, the reason this is reminding you of this and putting it into this discussion of of surveys is whenever you are making decisions on how to get information from people, you want to use the highest level scale you can. It's almost always the best. Though, caution you, you want to use the highest level scale you can that will yield good responses from your participants. You don't want to confuse them or put them in a situation where they might accidentally give you wildly varying or way off base kinds of responses. If you ask a question like, how much did you like this? And you think you've got them oriented towards a 0 to 100 scale, and they write down a lot, you really don't know where to place that on your scale. So it's much more important in that case to actually give them some kind of scale line for them to circle or make a mark on than to simply trust them to write down in an open-ended fashion what you want. So you got to be cautious, but always strive to come up with a way to get at the highest level of information content that you can for each of the questions. Next, we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, which is sampling. I appreciate your attention, and I'll see you next time.